Good morning. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. We have, as they say, but in this case it is particularly true, a most distinguished panel of economists to discuss the state of the world economy and policy and everything else. Very briefly, introductions. As you know, on my extreme left, John Taylor, Professor of Economics at Stanford. Also very famous monetary policy in many, many ways, but particularly for monetary policy, his expertise in monetary policy, author of the Taylor Rule. To my immediate left, Nouriel Roubini, Professor of Economics at NYU, also very, very famous, perhaps most notably for the sobriquet Dr. Doom, I think, for his forecasts about the US, accurate forecasts about the US economy and before the crash. And to my right, Ken Rogoff, Professor of Economics at Harvard, also extraordinarily distinguished and famous for, most recently, I suppose I should say, for co-authoring one of the most important books on financial history. This time it's different. So we actually have here not only great distinguished economists, in fact I think it's fair to sort of describe them as the kind of sort of Marvel Comics front line of the economics profession, really. Dr. Doom, the author of the Taylor Rule, and half of Reinhard Rogoff. So it's about as good as it gets. So let's start off appropriately enough with at home with the US economy. We've seen over the last 4, 5 the expansion. This expansion that began in the middle of 2009 is almost 5 years old. So it's already relatively long by historic standards. What it is also by historic standards, of course, is very, very weak. It's been actually the weakest expansion in terms of GDP growth, average GDP growth, that we've had in the post-Second World War era. And although there may be some signs that it's accelerating, it still seems to be pretty sluggish, pretty stagnant. Unemployment, although the official rate has come down significantly, underemployment remains a really significant problem. The economy as a whole seems to be really underperforming by any historic measures. So if I can start with you, Ken Rogoff, since you've studied financial history and these, especially after economic history, especially after financial crises, what's going on? Why does the US economy seem to be stuck in this stagnant phase of growth?
Well, I don't think there's any question that the first order thing is that we experienced a deep systemic financial crisis, and when that happens, you don't jump back out of bed right away. That's the big thing. But there's a lot of other things mixed in. A financial crisis doesn't happen in a vacuum. With the rise of Asia, are trying to adjust to competing with Asia is certainly an issue, many others. Inequality you could throw in, but also political paralysis that's happened in the aftermath. I mean, it didn't have to be like it is. We've gone through this period where policy's been, certainly worse than nothing, paralysis, and so that's it too.
What about and let me turn to you, Nouriel. There is this view, however, that there is something, maybe something deeper going on, something even more structural than some of the things that Ken has talked about. People have raised the specter again of this notion of secular stagnation, that a long run fundamental demand problem in the economy, or indeed some other problem, but secular stagnation refers particularly to that if you look not just at the last 6 years where growth's been weak, you can go back further and actually say, if you strip out the extraordinary stimulus that the US had in that period between 2001 and 2006 from the housing market in particular, the US has really not had a very impressive sustained rate of growth for more than a decade, and this leads people like Larry Summers, for example, to talk about secular stagnation. Do you think there is some deeper structural explanation to what's going on?
Certainly we can have a discussion whether this secular stagnation hypothesis is correct or not. There are two interpretations of it. One, I'm not convinced, that says that technological innovation is now slowing down, and that's a source of slow potential growth. Because if I look actually at innovation, there are lots of industries of the future, ET, energy technology like shale gas and oil, BT, biotech, with all the things that are occurring, stem cells research, gene therapy, neuroscience, biomedical research, IT, Web 2.0, 3.0, big data, social media, MT, new manufacturing technologies like nanotechnology, robotic automation, or even DT, in a world in which there are geopolitical conflicts now, there are weapon system defense technologies that are high-tech like drones. So there's a huge amount of technological innovation. I think that what's happening probably in terms of secular stagnation is that we have now, as pointed out by Ken and others, the aftermath of a balance sheet crisis when there was too much debt and leverage in the private sector and now too much debt and leverage in the public sector. So there's a painful process of deleveraging. But the second thing that's happened is related to debates right now about income inequality is that the trends are leading to higher income inequality. Leaving aside the morality of it, I think we're redistributing income from labor to capital, from wages to profits, and from people who have a high marginal propensity to spend, who have a lot of debt like households, to those who have a higher marginal propensity to save. And when this redistribution occurs, you have this paradox of you have firms that have trillions of dollars of profits, trillions of dollars of cash, and are not doing any capex. Why? Because of that of the households and because of the redistribution of income, consumption growth is anemic, and therefore there is excess capacity. Even today, capacity utilization only barely 80% in the United States, and therefore firms are doing lots of profits. They've been cutting costs that are somebody else's income and spending, but they're not spending it on capex. So I think that income inequality has this implication of reducing demand. So to me, secular stagnation is a combination of high debt and leverage with redistribution of income and inequality that leads to slowdown of growth driven on the demand side rather than the supply side.
Can we look? Let's turn to John Taylor. Let's look at the aspect, the role of policy in this. A lot of people obviously point to the fact that we have had this extraordinarily stimulative, possibly stimulative, I know you disagree in some respects, but accommodating policy from the Federal Reserve here and to some extent from other central banks around the world. Fed is obviously in the stages of unwinding some of that, but very, very early stages. There is a view that, as weak as growth has been, the only growth we've really had has largely come about because of this extraordinary stimulus. And once this is removed, we'll see really whether the economy is actually strong enough to withstand it. Let's talk a bit about what the Fed has done and what it should be doing. John, what's your role of what's been going on?
I think the Fed and their actions is part of a problem in policy more generally. It's become very interventionist policy with respect to monetary, also fiscal, also regulatory policy, extraordinary interventions. In fact, I think of this 10-year period which you're referring to, which is not good. We had this great recession, financial crisis, and now a slow recovery. I think a lot of that is the policy, and I've been writing about it since before the crisis. And when you say we had these great policies before the crisis, no, we had the first indication that the Fed was going to do some very low rates for a long time. It was a factor in the housing bubble and the search for yield. There were other problems with policy in that period. But I think of those 10 years as very disappointing. Compared to the 20, 25 years before that, we call it the Great Moderation, policy has screwed up royally, I think. And I would say it's not just monetary, it's fiscal, regulatory, across the board. It's really quite remarkable. And I think all these discussions about income inequality as a cause or secular stagnation for a cause, I think they're a distraction. I just don't think they make sense. They've come in late in the game, by the way, you notice. Secular stagnation is hardly a year old in terms of putting it forward. It doesn't make any sense to me to say that the economy was not overly stimulated going into the crisis. We had this run-up of housing prices. We had unemployment below 5%, 4.4%, and we had inflation picking up. So it seems to me it's just the most logical, factually based explanation for this performance is policy has screwed up. And I'd say the good news about that, if we fix policy, we'll be able to have strong growth again with fewer crises.
No, I want to make the point that actually these cycles is not just the last decade, where the real estate boom and bubble and bust in the 80s that led to the S&L crisis, and then there was a recession in 1991, then where the internet bubble went in the bust, and then we had the recession in 2001, 2003, then we had this subprime and credit bubble that went to a bust. It looks like for the last 25 years, the United States is growing fast only when there is a financial bubble, and that leads to excesses that lead to a crash and a bust, and every time is worse. And I think that's the way I think about income inequality. Why suddenly the private sector is indebted so much? Because, you want to keep up with the Joneses, because your median income have not been rising. And what you do, we liberalize the financial system, we allow everybody to borrow. Credit cards, personal loans, student loans, subprime loans, mortgage loans, you name it. And the manifestation of it has been a build-up of debt. So you have to think about why there has been these cycles of bubbles one after the other. We seem like to be able to grow in a more sustainable way. It's a bubble economy, but it's been going on for the last 25 years. It's not the last 10 years, right?
In the 70s, you're right. That was excesses, terrible policy. But for the most part, the 80s and 90s didn't have those problems. It's more recent. And yeah, you can point to some cycles, but they're minor compared to this great recession we've had.
Let's talk about what comes next, particularly with regard to the Fed. So the Fed is now embarked on this so-called tapering. They're on their way to concluding that, probably to withdrawing, to ending the purchase of assets probably before the end of this year. Now the question is what comes next after that. There's a lot of discussion about forward guidance, about what the Fed is going to do with rates. Ken, how do you see over the next year or so monetary policy? As this stimulus is withdrawn, what is going to take its place, and what effect might that have on markets and on the economy?
Well, I speak in the presence of John Taylor here, and you mentioned that the Taylor rule is very influential in monetary policy. I've been reading some sort of obscure central bank volumes recently, looking at emerging markets, and no matter tiny African country's got a Taylor rule for their central bank. I think if we land on the moon and they have a currency, they'll have a Taylor rule. We don't in the United States. And I think a problem with monetary policy is that it's been not rooted. You can understand it. There was a financial crisis. We hit the zero bound. They're following experimental policies, but they're sort of experimenting with experimental policies, and it creates a certain amount of uncertainty. I think if you ask what is going to happen, I assume they're going to keep very easy monetary policy for quite a while, understanding that there's some risks that it might cause in financial markets, but thinking that the balance of risks is that we stay in a deep recession. I actually, by and large, support that idea, except that I would like to see a more stable policy rule. They've been really changing from one to the other.
John, just quickly on that, if I may, where do you? I take it you think the Fed is kind of way off course right now. What if you were chairman of the Fed, not beyond the bounds of possibility? What should Janet Yellen be doing right now?
Well, I'd be preparing for a return to more rule-like policy, like worked pretty well in the 80s and 90s until recently, till we got off. You can't do that right away. Markets are sensitive, so you got to do it slowly. But I think that's where the Fed should go. It's been successful in the past. I don't think the quantitative easing has helped from my empirical evaluation. And the forward guidance, as you mentioned, has kind of been confusing. It's changed a lot. It's created some inconsistency. So I'm actually optimistic that it won't be right away, but there's some signs that the Fed will move back to the policies that I think worked well in the past. We'll see.
How quickly can the Fed shrink its balance sheet? I mean, without damaging financial confidence?
I think what they're doing now is much better than what I talked about doing last summer. Remember, they had the taper tantrum. Former Chairman Ben Bernanke talked about it, sort of riled up financial markets. But now they've got kind of a strategy. You might complain about the strategy. It's sort of reducing the size of the purchases gradually. And I think if they morph that into a gradual reduction in the size of the balance sheet, it would make sense of a continuation of that strategy. I think it would work.
I think there's a major shift in monetary policy after the global financial crisis, because before the global financial crisis, the Taylor rule was one in which a central bank cared on one side about growth or unemployment relative to trend or NIRO, and on the other side, inflation. After the global financial crisis, I think there is an additional role of the central bank, that is financial stability, avoiding bubbles in the economy. Now, if you think about it, now you have two separate goals: economic stability, maintaining strong growth, reducing unemployment rate, avoiding low inflation, but you want to avoid also financial bubbles. Now, some people within the Fed, like Janet Yellen or Ben Bernanke, believe you have two goals and you have two instruments: monetary policy for the real economy and macroprudential supervision regulation of the financial system to avoid financial bubbles. But however, there are many people, starting within the Fed, Jeremy Stein, who believe that actually macro-pru is not going to work, right? It's untested, it's not worked in the past. You cap leverage in one part of the banking system, zero rate and liquidity brings leverage in other parts of the banking system, impose leverage ratios for the entire banking system, the liquidity is going to go to the unregulated shadow banking system. So suppose you have only one instrument, because like Jeremy Stein says, there is only one thing you can get in all the cracks of the financial system, is interest rate. You have one instrument, you have two goals, but then them if you do and them if you don't, because if the economy is weak, you have to exit very slowly, but you're creating now frothiness in financial market, and eventually you'll have a huge bubble in credit, in real estate, in the financial market. Or if instead you use monetary policy to prick the bubble, you risk having a bond market drought and killing the recovery and hard landing. So I think the biggest issue for central banks is not going to be, of course, when you taper or when you start raising rates. For the Fed, for the BOJ, for the ECB, for the Riksbank, for the SMB, for the BOE, the fundamental problem is going to be how you have a strong recovery of the economy while maintaining financial stability. That's going to be the key issue for central banks next few years. And the risk is you're going to get it wrong. This is knife edge. Either you do it too soon and kill the recovery, or you do it too late and you have another moderable bubble. So I think that's going to be the fundamental problem we have to face in terms of central banking.
I can imagine, Gerard, you might want to talk about Japan later, but I think a lot of central banks are looking at Japan, who are doing something very dramatic. They've been up against the zero bound for a long time, and you can argue that they should have got out of it a long time earlier, but what they're doing is really very dramatic, and I think the ECB, for example, may look at what Japan did eventually. I'm actually curious, John, of what you think about Japan, and are they crazy? I mean, I'm a believer in what they're doing, I'll say in advance, but I can imagine you might not be.
I do want to come to Japan, but let's quickly move on in sort of order of magnitude of the global economy, then we'll come back to some of these US themes, but let's move on to China. Obviously, China's going through a very important phase of development right now. It is downshifting, at least that's the objective of the government. That seems to be the facts of the economic data, downshifting from a very accelerated rate of growth down towards perhaps what people think of as a more sustainable rate of maybe targeting 7.5%, and at the same time trying to shift the composition of growth away from that traditional very, very high savings, high investment, high export-led growth towards more consumption-led growth. And this new administration has been in power now just over a year, does seem to be very much committed to, at least verbally committed, and we've seen some policies on that too. Nuril, you've been in China recently. How's it going? I mean, people worry about all kinds of things, social unrest as a result of the slow rate of growth. They continue to worry about financial bubbles. Where's the Chinese economy headed?
Well, I think there are two extreme views on China, and both of them are wrong. One is the consensus that says they're going to have a 7.5% growth for the next few years and a soft landing. And then, of course, there is the other extreme view of a total financial, economic, and meltdown with growth at 3-4%. I think the reality is that while they do recognize that their growth model is unsustainable, uncoordinated, as they say, fixed investment is 50% of GDP, savings more than 50%, and consumption only 35% of GDP. The rebalancing from one to the other, in my view, is going to occur much more slowly than desirable and optimal for two reasons. One is that the interest groups that are in favor of the old growth model are powerful. State-owned enterprises, provincial governments, the SPVs, the PLA, the state sector, while those are going to be benefiting from a growth rate that is consumption-oriented, labor-intensive, workers and households are politically not strong because it's not a democracy. Secondly, when I was in November in China, our delegation met both the President Xi and the Prime Minister Li, and both of them said it's utmost our goal to have a 7.5% growth during this decade because we have an objective of doubling GDP within the decade. It's a political objective. But if you're really serious about the rebalancing and stopping this build-up of credit, every time growth slows down towards 7%, in the last 5 years, they've gone into a panic and they've done another round of what? Credit-fueled fixed investment. That means more bad assets in the banks and the shadow banks, more NPLs, more bad investment in real estate, in infrastructure, in industrial capacity is already excessive, and more debts that are private and public that are excessive. The leverage ratio right now in China is 240% and rising between private and public debt, and that's eventually is going to lead to a hard landing. Now, to me, a hard landing is not 3-4% growth, but I think that by next year, growth is going to be 6%, and the next year could be lower than 6%. It's not a real hard landing, but it's not the soft landing of the consensus. If there is something that's not priced in by financial market, is a sharp slowdown of China of this order of magnitude.
John, do you see those kind of risks in China?
Yes, I would add a couple. I think the demography is something that really, for maybe over a little bit longer term, is going to be a problem for them because of the population policy, and that's going to be a struggle, I think, to figure out. It's sort of coming earlier in their development in other countries, in Japan in particular, so I'd watch out for that. Second, there is a problem with global trade slowing quite a bit since the crisis, before the crisis actually, it dipped down, recovered, but it's still quite flat. And that makes it really harder for them to do the switch. So there's two other things I'd mention.
And what about the central bank? I mean, the People's Bank of China has been doing some very interesting things recently, in particular on the currency, right? I mean, for a long, long time, we've seen the RMB as a one-way bet. We assumed it was going to appreciate, and indeed it has, for a very long time within those very narrow ranges that the government sets. Recently, of course, it's gone the other way, and it's introduced at least some element of exchange rate risk to markets. Is that something that you expect to, is the central bank just sort of essentially, as they are saying, trying to warn people that actually there is a two-way market, or is this part of a more important shift?
No, I think so. They basically wanted to take away the one-sided bet and have more. We always talked about kind of a floating, more flexible rate rather than just a change in the level. And I think the governor recognizes that, Governor Joe, and they're trying to implement that. So to me, it's a movement towards a better policy, also with sort of more integrated currency eventually.
Ken, do you think, are you concerned about this financial imbalances in China, or these issues of what happens as China slows down?
You have to be. I mean, we don't have very good data on it. I mean, for starters, I don't even think they have very good data on what's going on in China. And, certainly the history is when somebody's growing gangbusters like that and their credit piles up, because you start doing that towards the end game when you don't know another way to keep things going, that you could eventually run into trouble. Now, it is an unusual situation. There's tremendous state control. They have a lot of reserves. There are a lot of reasons that this time is different for China. But I don't believe any of it. I mean, I think that they will run into trouble. And Nouriel, I agree with you that the slowdown, when it happens, could be to 6%, but that's what they report. I mean, I think what reported fluctuations in China understate what's actually happening. So yeah, I know, I certainly think it's a concern. It's healthy. I mean, they can't just, the investment, the World Bank did a report a few years ago where investment was going to 65% of GDP, at already 50% of GDP. You just can't. The Soviet Union tried that, Japan tried that,
but
it runs out.
You say it's healthy, but don't they need really an elevated rate of growth, perhaps in the 7.5 range, to continue this, essentially to keep the people happy, or to keep this process of migration from the country to the city? And if it slows down, all of the kind of social pressures that are under the surface could clearly burst out.
Well, I think it's political. There's a lot of scope to provide some redistribution here. So, there are vested interest groups that are doing very well, some of the exporting firms on the coast. And they have a lot of instruments. It's political, and it's not easy. They've been amazing how they've managed it so far. I mean, this is, they're setting records. They're like a basketball team that's won more games in a row than anybody's won already, and you're asking, are they going to win another 10? Probably not. Usually the best bet, when that happens. But it's a very difficult situation. I mean, I think it's hard to avoid some kind of rough landing, really, in the next 5 years.
I think that actually there are many risks in the financial reform that are occurring right now, because while I was in China, I met the governor of the central bank, PBOC, Zhu, and others, and they're very serious about slowing down the credit growth and imposing financial reform. They're talking about not only flexibilizing the exchange rate, but liberalize the capital account, both inflow and outflows. They want to liberalize now the deposit rate after the lending rate. They want to give deposit insurance to the commercial banks, but commit not to bail out the depositors or liability of the shadow banks. They talk about market discipline and allowing default of some local governments, some enterprises, even of some shadow banks. But think about it. If you do the capital account liberalization and you're doing this adjustment, you could have a run on the currency and massive capital flight. Suppose you don't do the capital account liberalization, but you let some shadow banks go bust. You don't know which one is actually insolvent, which one is illiquid. Look what happened to the shadow banking system in the United States. You have short-term liability, longer-term, complex, illiquid investments. Once there is a run on one, there'll be a run on the entire system, right? Because you're guaranteeing now the deposits of the bank, you're giving interest rates on the deposit of the banks that is competitive with the shadow banks. Why would you want to put your money into a shadow bank? So I think they're not seriously considering the consequences of seriously going against moral hazard and imposing, because they know there's a moral hazard problem, right? The shadow banks have been growing, given the implicit bailout guarantee of their depositors. There's gambling for redemption. They're saying we're going to crack down, but there's a trade-off between moral hazard and a run. And the risk is you're going to have a generalized run on the shadow banking system. Now, when you ask them about how you're going to manage that, they're talking about, the best I've heard, controlled panic. That to me is an oxymoron. How can you have a controlled panic? Once a panic starts, it's not controlled, as we've seen with the U.S. financial crisis.
It is
right?
an administered economy, and probably better than any other I'm not saying it's necessarily a virtue, but in terms of being able to manage a crisis, one would imagine they're not going to have to.
Well, you know,
they're not going to have to go to the National People's Congress and ask for the equivalent.
Well, the shadow banks don't have deposit insurance. If you go and serious about it, they don't have a lender of last resort support. So if you're going to be serious about moral hazard and let one of them go bust, then you'll have a run on the entire system. I think that's going to be the risk they're facing. Now, they want to do it as a way of imposing discipline to slow down the credit growth in the shadow banks, in the formal banks, and impose a slowdown of the leverage ratio. That the objective is right, but the side consequences could be actually a financial crisis. Now, they have the fiscal resources to backstop everybody, but backstopping the shadow banks is going to imply a fiscal cost that is much larger than backstopping the formal banks.
Let's move on to across the Sea of Japan to Japan. As Ken said, and I want to ask John this, engaged on this extraordinary experiment in policy, certainly monetary policy, to some extent fiscal policy. We'll see about the third arrow of Abenomics. But on monetary policy, John in particular, an aggressive stimulus that actually makes what the Fed's been doing look like T-ball. I mean, it's an extraordinarily aggressive approach. It has clearly had some effects on the currency, on the equity market, extraordinary run-up in equity prices. Is it going to work? And by the way, on measured inflation as well, we're starting to see for the first time, some sustained inflation. But is it going to work in the long term?
Well, I think it already has worked in the sense of the currency, and I think of what happened there somewhat differently, perhaps, is that it almost was a response to the Fed. And the easy policy. Remember, the currency got so strong, and it never returned to the values before the crisis, and it was hurting the economy, and it became a huge political issue. And Abe ran on that, and he said, "Well, I'm going to do something about it," and he did. He appointed Kuroda, and Kuroda changed policy, and the yen just moved exactly back to where it was before the crisis. So to me, that is an example of the spillover from monetary policy here and elsewhere. It really had a currency effect, and they responded by doing the same thing, easy policy. So I interpret a lot of it that way, and it has impacted. Interpreting what it's doing to inflation now is hard because you've got this tax that's coming in, coming out, and there's anticipation of it, and then it's swinging the economy around, almost like the weather, so it's hard to see. But my guess is it will affect the inflation rate too, but now it's pretty much just the currency. And just if I could add, the most disappointing thing about Abenomics is there's no third arrow out there. They're just unable to shoot it, and I think that's the most important thing for that economy.
Before I come to you, Ken, what about the fiscal side? This has been the dog that hasn't barked for years. Japan's fiscal condition, debt to GDP ratio well over 200%. Now, of course, everybody's always been relaxed about it because it's funded out of domestic savings. They have huge domestic savings, but it's growing. It continues to grow. Obviously, the theory of Abenomics is that you get growth and then you'll be able to get it down that way. At what point do we really have to start worrying about Japan's fiscal condition?
I think it's a constraint on policy already. And part of the reason they didn't do this before, when it was sort of the consensus thing to do, is they were afraid what would happen to interest rates. Ask yourself the question, what if Abenomics works? And they convince everybody inflation is going to be higher and interest rates go up. We don't know what would happen. So it's certainly been a point of vulnerability. Now, they're a giant creditor nation. They have a lot in reserves. Just looking at their debt grossly over-exaggerates what their fiscal position is, because they have huge dollar reserves, for example, that cut it back a lot. But of course, it's a constraint. But again, I think a lot of people are looking at what happens there. Certainly, Larry Summers, you mentioned before, has repeatedly said, I'm going to compare what happens in the UK and Japan, because as I understand economics, the UK is going to do horribly and Japan's going to do very well. And I think a lot of people will be looking at the fiscal side also.
UK just reported annualized growth of about 3.5% this morning, I think, in the first quarter. So maybe we may have the jury's still out, but maybe it's leaning in a particular direction. Nouriel, anything else on Japan?
I'm actually reasonably constructive of Abenomics. 2 years ago, Japan was stuck in deflation, double-dip recession, public debt to GDP ratio above 200% and rising. Now, thanks to Abenomics, first you had the first and second arrow of aggressive monetary and fiscal stimulus. You stop deflation, the economy started to recover, the currency weakened, the stock market goes up, there is a change in sentiment. Now the second arrow from a fiscal stimulus is becoming a fiscal consolidation. They need to do it because eventually, otherwise the debt is going to become unsustainable. This year from 5 to 8%, next year to 8 to 10%, doing the fiscal adjustment. And on the third arrow, I would say that's a key one because in the long run, of course, if they can survive this debt ratio, you have to grow the denominator GDP. But I would say they're not doing as much as optimal and desirable, but I wouldn't say they're doing nothing. This year, there's going to be a reduction in corporate taxes. They want really to do the TPP with the US and other Pacific partners. There is going to be some deregulation of the economy. They're trying to flexibilize the labor market and increasing labor force participation of women, even opening up migration.
They have been talking about deregulation for 30 years in Japan.
Yeah, but for example, now they have about 10 special economic zones where essentially you can hire whoever you want. There's not going to be regulation. They'll do a bit of what China is doing with the Shanghai trade zone, experimenting and then going national. There's this reform of the GPIF is going to lead them to diversify their investments from bonds into equities and so on. There's a wide range of things. I would say they're less than desirable and optimal, but at least the first derivative is going the right direction, even the second derivative is not as optimal. So I think in the long run, of course, the key thing is going to be, can you have a fiscal consolidation doesn't lead to a sharp slowdown of the economy, at the same time you do the structural reform that increase potential growth and stabilize and then reduce the debt ratio. At least they're moving in the right direction. The alternative was worse. And by the way, in terms of monetary policy, I don't think that what the BOJ has done is more unconventional. The Fed balance sheet has gone from 800 billion to 4 trillion. Soon enough, it's going to be 4.5. They've just doubled their own base money. So every central bank, whether it's the BOJ, ECB, BOE, SMB, or Fed, they've done any combination of zero policy rates, quantitative easing, credit easing, and forward guidance in different combinations, but it's just the same kind of unconventional tools that everybody has done. And I would even expect that ECB is going to do by June quantitative easing. So even ECB is going to go on board on that.
Let's move on because we've only managed to get through about half global GDP so far. So let's move on to, John, if I may ask you, to Europe. And first, obviously, the Eurozone. The patient seems to be out of intensive care that it's been in for most of the last few years. But is its condition still terminal?
I think there's still problems. I think there is some good developments recently, but and Ken has written about this a lot. The debt ratios are still high in a number of these countries, and they're going to have to find out how to deal with that. I don't think the fundamentals are in shape at this point. I think the ECB is a difficult road because of this whole problem, and I sympathize with Draghi in many respects. But in terms of the inflation, deflation risks, I don't see them at this point.
You don't see the ECB's meeting this week, a lot of talk about deflation and they may need to do more. You don't see it?
It's all over the place. My view is it's not the concern that many are stating.
Really? Ken, Europe, I mean, monetary policy or the fiscal policy side, as John says, you know, they've dealt with the immediate crisis, but there are big fiscal problems and more broadly, structural economic problems that remain, right?
Well, certainly a major thing they've done is convince people that they really, really want to stay together no matter how painful and maybe even not necessarily wise it is in every case. And that's brought remarkable stability. That's got to be helpful for the economy, for investment, for growth over the longer term. But, you know, at the same time, the stability then stops the progress on the banking union that they need to do, some kind of fiscal union, I think some kind of write-downs in the debts in the periphery countries under the table maybe. And so the question is whether it just becomes Japanified in a way where it's stable, it's rich, but it's not growing. I mean, and then will there be political stability if you keep these high unemployment rates and that are still well into double digits in many of the periphery countries, and not so great in France either.
Do you think the ECB needs to do more? Should it?
I think they need to do more because there is a real risk of a deflationary spiral or Japanification in the case of the Eurozone. There are, of course, some positives, of course. The risk of a breakup, of a Greek exit, or Italy, Spain losing market access is much lower than a year or two ago, thanks to whatever it takes, thanks to OMT, ESM, the beginning of a banking union. The recession now is a recovery. But if you look at the fundamental problems of the Eurozone, potential growth in the periphery is low because structural reform are occurring too slowly. Secondly, you have that the actual recovery is going to be extremely anemic, barely 1% growth for the Eurozone, less than that in the periphery, and therefore unemployment rates of 25% in Spain and Greece, 50% among the young, slightly lower than that in the rest of the periphery. 3, the improvement in trade balances has been only partially structural. Part of it is essentially suppression of imports, and therefore the fundamental problem, competitiveness, has not been resolved, especially in Italy, especially in France. 4, the debt ratio in the private and public sector are still rising because the denominator, this nominal GDP, is not growing very much. You have austerity fatigue in the periphery. You have bailout fatigue in the core. The euro is way too strong. You still have a credit crunch because 5 years after the US did TARP, they're still thinking about doing the AQR and the stress test and eventually recapitalizing the banks. So the banks are still deleveraging by selling assets and contracting credit. And therefore now inflation is low, has fallen from 2.7% in 2011 to 0.5% last month. And I expect it actually is going to fall further. Therefore, either the ECB takes seriously the issue about price stability, because they're well below their target of 2%, and I expect them actually in June they're going to go and do quantitative easing rather than credit easing, rather than a negative deposit rate, to try to weaken the value of the euro, try to boost the competitiveness of the Eurozone, or otherwise this deflation. I think the Eurozone is 1 or 2 shocks away from outright deflation. It's something they have to worry about.
John, I'm surprised actually that you don't think deflation is a risk, and you don't think the ECB needs to do more. I mean, doesn't Nouriel have a point? Inflation is well below their target. Wouldn't basic Taylor rule even?
They have their inflation target of roughly 2%. They should respect that, I think. And so when it's below, you'd have policy easier than otherwise. But you don't have infinitely easy policy. There's a confusion, I think. People say, oh, the inflation rate's below target, and maybe unemployment or GDP gap is off, and so you should just gun it. That's not what we learned from policy. There's a easier than normal, but not infinitely easier. And I think that's the confusion. If you look at, Ken's referring to policy rules, if you look at policy rules, they don't suggest infinite ease. They suggest easier than otherwise, and that's how I interpret it. Downward spirals of inflation we're always talking about. We don't really see it that often. Even in Japan, there was not a downward spiral. It wasn't good, but it wasn't like it in itself was accelerating. We have some models in economics that show you how you can get these downward spirals, and I think they've influenced central banking policy, but fortunately we haven't seen them.
Well, when you're in deflation, and a number of countries in the periphery of Eurozones are in deflation, the real value of your debt is rising, and that's one of the reasons why public debt is high and rising, because they have outright deflation. So if you take seriously the mandates of 2%, you're not doing anything about it, then, and they've tried. Right now, policy rates, the refi rate is at 25 basis points. So it's effectively 0. So you have only 3 options. Either you do a negative deposit rate, or you do credit easing, or you do quantitative easing, because on the conventional side, you are 25 basis points from the zero bound.
Let John answer that.
How do you know it's not easy enough? Also on the debt.
Because inflation is low and falling, and there's a huge output gap.
It's low.
Let John answer.
It's low. It's below its target, so the policy should be easier for that. On the debt, one of the things I think economists have screwed up is when the Eurozone was formed, not to be stronger on the fiscal side. We knew that this was going to be a problem, and we actually knew the Eurozone would be a problem in itself, but it required things like the Maastricht Treaty being followed. Instead, we talked about, oh, you can have fiscal stimulus and it'll be okay, and it's led to a mess. And I think the more we continue to encourage that, the worse off we will be. Right now, the responsible thing is for these countries to either deal with the debt as indicated, as Ken indicated, or to deal with the fiscal side.
Before we move on from Europe, let's just quickly, this major political crisis in Eastern Europe, obviously. So far, at least, the economic implications seem to be relatively small and manageable. We don't know what's going to happen to Russia's economy as a result of the sanctions or a result of the kind of loss of confidence there. But how much do any of you see that an economic dimension to what's going on in Ukraine for the global economy? Is it a risk?
Well, it raises the outside risks of trouble somewhere, probably weakens, for the moment, the U.S.'s, credibility in different ways. And so it's not a good thing. I think we would like to have Russia feel that they're invested in the global economy, that the system works for them, that they're going to do well, rather than that they, want to create mischief and want to create uncertainty. And that relationship's important. It can sprout in other ways. But at the moment, yeah, I think it's contained, but it's not a healthy development. Would be an understatement.
I think on the sanctions, the problem is not being able to get international movement. I, as you know, worked for the sanctions originally with Al-Qaeda and freezing assets, and that international cooperation was essential. And then, of course, in the case of North Korea and in the Iranian economy. But we don't have that now, and I just don't think it's going to work.
The Europeans in particular seem to have too much at stake, right?
As far as I can see, there needs to be some diplomacy to bring that about, and I don't see it right now. Just one thing about, you mentioned Eastern Central Europe. There is good, don't forget Poland. Don't forget these countries that have benefited so well from good economic policy.
Well, I would say that so far financial markets and investors have been relatively unconcerned about Ukraine and Russia. Of course, Russia is going to have a small recession this year because they don't think this is systemic. As long as the conflict is contained, I would agree on that. But let's have the following scenario, maybe downside, in which Russia is serious about destabilizing the eastern provinces of Ukraine. Then there is a military attack. At that point, the US and Europe, the least they can do is not only to increase sanctions that lead to counter-sanctions by Russia, but also provide some military support in terms of weapons to the government in Kiev. Then the Cold War between Russia and the West risks to become a hot war between Ukraine and Russia and maybe the West. And then at that point, the risk of episode of financial contagion. In the extreme case, suppose that Russia were to decide in that hot war to cut off the supply of gas, not just to Ukraine, but also to Western Europe. European economy is barely recovering from a recession. Growth is anemic, is uneven. The last thing that certainly Europe afford and need is going to be a shock to the price of the supply of gas. That will be the tipping point for the Eurozone. So in that downside scenario, I don't know what's the probability of it. Some people think it's a low probability, but that probability right now is rising given the events of the last 2 weeks. Actually, the repercussion could be more than just Ukraine and Russia. It could spread actually to global financial market and to the Eurozone economy and tip it into recession. It's a risk.
And before we finally leave Europe, the UK, just briefly, Ken mentioned it, it's been seen to some extent as a test case of austerity. The austerity is not quite as great as some of its critics and supporters would say it has been, but it does right now look, the UK economy is the strongest growing economy in the G7. It's growing much faster than the Eurozone. This is after several years of a reasonably tight fiscal policy. What conclusions do you draw? Does austerity work?
Austerity certainly works if it's done gradually in a credible way. I think some of the austerity in the last few years, 3 or 4 years ago, was on the tax side, and I think that was problematic for the UK. I think it's good news the UK is doing better, but if you go back to the kind of question you asked about the US originally, I mean, it looks worse. You basically had this ridiculously slow recovery. You're not even above the previous peak in output, or just barely at that level. So that whole phenomenon of policy is very much a question with respect to the British economy, and I think it's the uncertainty of the monetary policy through a lot of this. It's the uncertainty of the fiscal policy, generally in the right direction, and of course there's a lot of regulation issues there too. So the story is similar to me, and it may be even worse in the UK than the US.
Let's move on then quickly to emerging markets very quickly. I mean, we used to think of emerging markets as a single thing. We talked about the BRICS or the performance of emerging markets generally. One thing we've learned in the last year is that there are lots and lots of different emerging markets, and they all seem to be behaving differently. But Nouriel, you've been traveling a lot. What's your sense? I mean, they've obviously been they were significantly disrupted last year by the initial concern about what the Fed was going to do. That led to some really sharp falls in currencies and equity markets in some of those countries. Some of that has seemed to have stabilized. Where are we now in some of those countries like South Africa, Turkey, India, Indonesia, the sort of, these fragile 5 countries that people talk about? Have they stabilized?
Well, first of all, I would say in addition to the fragile 5, India, Indonesia, Turkey, Brazil, and South Africa, there's another group of emerging markets that are fragile for a similar combination of factors. Of course, Ukraine, Russia, Hungary, Argentina, Venezuela, and Thailand for geopolitical reasons. The Fragile Five had in common twin current account and fiscal deficit, loose monetary and fiscal and credit policy, leading to rising in inflation, falling growth, and all of them have either legislative or presidential election this year, so that creates a little bit of political and policy uncertainty. The other ones have other types of things. I would say that compared to a year ago, the Fragile Five have done policy adjustment on the monetary and fiscal, not ideal, but if I look at the whole group of emerging markets, there are several factors that make me worry. First of all, global tailwinds are becoming headwinds, things that supported emerging markets for the last decade. The Fed, however, slowly is going to exit zero policy rates, and therefore money is going to flow out of emerging markets. China is not going to grow at 10%, at best 7%, in my view, even lower than that. And the global commodity super cycle is over, not just because of China, but because there are new players that are increasing supply. So those are becoming headwinds. Additionally, a bunch of emerging markets in years of zero policy rates, where there was a search for yield, had looser monetary policy, looser fiscal policy, looser credit policy. Now they have to do painful macro adjustment. But fifth and more important factor, many of these emerging markets in the last decade had the lost decade for structural reforms. If anything, not only they didn't do structural reform that increased potential growth through micro-oriented competition and other things that increase productivity, but many of them moved away from it towards models of growth of variants of state capitalism. Too much of a role of the state-owned enterprise in the economy, too much role of the state-owned banks in the allocation of credit and savings investment, resource nationalism, import substitution, industrialization. Of course, the models of that were China and Russia, but look at India, look at, for example, Argentina, Venezuela, even Brazil, even other countries, they all moved away. There are now studies suggesting that the potential growth in the typical emerging market might have fallen by 1%, in some cases 2%. So you had high returns in emerging market last decade because of high potential growth, global tailwinds, and better macro. Now those tailwinds are becoming headwinds, the macro is more fragile, and on the structural side you have to do painful stuff that many of these countries politically are going to find hard to do. Therefore, in the next 10 years, I worry that actually returns and growth in MEM, or some of them, you cannot generalize, is not going to be as strong as it has been in the last decade.
Thank you. Let's move on. In the last 15 minutes, we've covered the world there very comprehensively. Let's look at some of these themes, some of these topics that are very hot globally, particularly in the United States, but they have real global resonance too. The first, and I really want all of your views on this, is a very hot topic, which is this issue of inequality. Income and wealth inequality, we've seen it obviously in the developed world increase dramatically, particularly in the United States in the last 20 years or so. The sort of hottest property in the publishing world right now is Professor Piketty of France and his book with his proposals, analysis and proposals for what should be done about income inequality. But let me start off with you, if I may, Ken. There's no doubting the numbers. Inequality has increased enormously. Why should we be concerned about that? And if so, why?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons we should be concerned about it. And yes, I think the numbers are pretty clear. And Piketty and Saez have had papers about this for a long time, about income inequality, wealth inequality. And other people more recently have come at it from other directions. For example, the rising share of capital versus labor. People found that. Brent Naiman at Chicago has been finding that. So that does seem to be a very real phenomenon. I want to be careful, though, just to remember that if we treat everyone in the world the same, we might not think it had become so unequal. I mean, this has been, from 40,000 feet, the miracle that's happened in India and China, desperate poverty, billions of people no longer in desperate poverty. If you really care about world inequality, this hasn't been a bad period. It's been maybe arguably the best period, but it's certainly had this effect within the nation state of blowing up inequality because Nouriel, explained it earlier that they're at the changing nature of technology, global trade has created these winners and losers. And I think the delicate question is how to, maintain continuing growth while mitigating this inequality problem. And there's certainly some ridiculous policies we have in the United States. I mean, my personal belief in the tax system, the way we tax very high income earners, I don't, think be as good a system as if we had a simple flat tax with a high deductible. But by and large, this is driven by technology, and there ought to be some response. But I mean, again, you mentioned Thomas Piketty's book, which is quite a sensation. The papers underlying it are terrific, very important science. But there are a lot of recommendations that it's part of what's driving it.
80% income
tax rate, wealth tax.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of better ways to do things. I sit back and look at them and I think, well, it's a great package of proposals for the United States to make France competitive again.
John, I'm guessing you don't favor an 80% tax rate, but is this issue of, I mean, one of the things that the way the debate has moved recently is that it's not only an issue of fairness or social concerns about social issues. It may be even, inequality may be so great that it may be inhibiting growth in some ways. There's an argument that it's actually having an effect on growth. Do you think that's true?
Well, I've heard that argument. I certainly don't think it applies to the recent problems. As you mentioned, the inequality started moving apart in the 80s and 90s. And if anything, it's been squabbled by the crisis. Also, if you think about this slow recovery, it's not like the savings rate's extra high, it's low. So it's not consistent with the view that inequality is causing it. I think the concerns about the inequality is if it represents an inequality of opportunity. And I'm worried it does. And to me, the main focus should be on that. How do you give an equality of opportunity? And that I think we are failing greatly, and perhaps the way the debate is moving, it's taking away from this problem, and that is to the education for the most disadvantaged, or more generally in the United States. That's a failure, a serious policy failure. And the more we talk about other aspects of this, I think we take attention away from that, and that's a real disappointment to me. If I could just, I think, point about world inequality and the amazing improvements that we've had, taking millions and millions of people out of poverty, is something we need to focus on. I'd say emerging markets in the last 10 years, many of them have done better. They guys have got their macro house in order compared to where they were in the 90s. We haven't had these major financial crises coming out of emerging markets. If anything, they weathered our crisis much better than anyone thought of. And I think that's because they got their macro policies better. Yes, the micro needs to have more work. They used to be macro chaos and micro controlled. Now they're getting some macro control, but they need to get some more micro chaos on deregulation. But I think it's very promising what they did. And in a way, the danger here is if we move away from these principles that we thought were so important, and I mentioned that at the beginning, sort of emphasizing markets, emphasizing incentives, emphasizing predictability of policy. If we move away from that, I think the rest of the world will move away. We are a country which people look at, and I think our demonstration of what good macro policy would be spread in the last dozen years, and now, unfortunately, I think with all the to-ing and froing of QE and the taper tantrum and this, it's sort of confusing things now.
Nouriel, do we need a policy response to deal with this issue of inequality, and if so, what should it be?
Well, I would say before we think about the policy response, we have to think about the causes of it and then see what we can do about it. And I see several trends. One, as I pointed out, is that technological innovation is becoming very capital intensive, skill bias, and labor saving, not only saving traditional unskilled blue-collar workers, but now many jobs that are white-collar, because of the tradability of services, are becoming first offshored, and eventually a computer, a piece of software is going to do it as well. So in the first industrial revolution, you had a poor farmer, you take him off the farm, you put him on the factory floor, division of labor, you have more output, more profits, but more productivity and more wages. While in the third manufacturing revolution, that is robotic and automation, the factory of the future is going to be 1,000 machines or robots, one guy, man or woman, manning all of them, and a third guy sweeping the floor, right? Cleaning the floor, and soon enough there'll be a Roomba robot who's cleaning the floor faster and better than the guy, so even that job is going to be gone, right? So the point is there'll be a huge amount of technological innovation, a lot of productivity. Those who have financial and physical capital are going to do well. The 25% of the labor distribution is highly skilled is going to do well. But the question is going to be, what are going to be the jobs and the incomes of unskilled workers that are either blue collar and white collar? Now you add to that one trade and globalization. You add to that 2.5 billion Chinese and Indians joining the global labor supply, and soon enough, billions of more people in Africa, Central America, and you name it. And you add to that these winner-take-all effects where the superstars in every field, the top banker, the top entrepreneur, the top economist, the top lawyer, the top journalist is getting a larger share of those rents because now the market is becoming billions of people, and therefore they extract more in that pyramid. So you have major trends that are going to lead to greater inequality, not just shifting of labor to capital, but also within labor income, those who are at the top doing better than everybody else. So I think those phenomena eventually, historically, lead either to social and political instability, unless you address them, or they lead to some taxation of wealth, income, capital, and redistribution. Now, if we have to invest into education, into training, and other stuff for all these people, I'm all in favor of it, but you have to pay for it. And whether you pay it or not is key on the fiscal sustainability, and the way to pay for it is going to be some greater taxation of people who have higher income and capital. I'm not in favor of 80% taxation of capital income, but I would say over time, whether we like it or not, in US, in Europe, and other advanced economies, there'll be slightly more progressive taxation, and that's the price we have to pay for it. There's no other alternative, the way I see it.
Very quickly, just on one other topic which Nouriel has touched on, Ken, if I may ask you, is this issue of employment, with the sort of the apparent erosion of employment, particularly in the US. Participation rate in the US is at a very, very sort of historic low, and doesn't seem to be any prospect of it rising anytime soon. What's going on? Is this again? This does look like a long-term structural change. What's the future of employment for the US?
Well, if you're really talking, a long period, as Nouriel's looking at, I think it's hard to know. I have to say, in labor economics, one of the puzzles is that the work week didn't shorten as much as people thought. I mean, Keynes, when he wrote about it, guessed we'd be at 15 hours by now. It didn't happen. People retire actually almost at the same time, but they live longer. And so, it's not impossible that we have a future where there's full employment, incomes are high, and I'm talking 20 or 30 years from now when all this technology somehow starts benefiting people and work weeks are just much shorter and the robots cleaning the floor. Let's look at the way we are at home. I mean, that's what happens. There's a lot of things that, used to be household work that aren't household work anymore. Some of this may shift over. It doesn't all have to be catastrophic. But absolutely, I would second what Nouriel said if I wasn't clear enough about it before. I mean, you have to have some more progressive taxation across the advanced countries. That's been kind of clear for a long time.
John, on this issue of employment, is this? I mean, are we just going to get used to this? Because in the past,
I think you look historically, we have innovations in technology, right, and the unemployment rate has sort of stayed where it is in equilibrium, and other things happen. I think now we've had this terrible performance in the last few years in the crisis, and that's made employment hopefully temporarily more of a problem. But ultimately, it seems to me that we have every reason to be optimistic that if the flexibility is there, that people will adjust and will take advantage of the technology. I think the skills are really important. And it's actually, if you look detailed at the problems, just a statistic, in California, the scores for 8th grade Hispanics are 48th in the country. In Texas, same roughly size of Hispanic population, it's 2nd in the country. It's not a matter of resources, it's a matter of delivering good quality education, and it's a management issue.
Why is California failing its Hispanic students? What's wrong?
Texas uses computer grading on their high school exams.
Yeah, it's largely accountability, I believe.
Right. Quickly, Nouriel, just and then
on jobs, I'll be a little bit more pessimistic than John, because in the past there was a lot of productivity growth in manufacturing. We're shedding jobs in manufacturing and creating jobs in services like government, finance, real estate, retail, education, healthcare. But right now, the same technological revolution that occurred in manufacturing is occurring in many services. I mean, take the ebook revolution. It's great for all of us. We can download with an iPad or a Kindle any book for $10, but has destroyed all the jobs in print and distribution. And the same thing is going to happen in healthcare, in education, in government, in finance, and so on. I mean, why do we need, say, 100,000 professors of economics? You take the top 100 gurus in the country, you do an online course for $100, and all those other jobs are gone. Today, a radiologist in Mumbai can do the same job as a radiologist in New York for 1/4 of the wage, and soon enough there'll be a piece of software who can do your x-rays better than a radiologist in New York or Mumbai. So there are major shifts in technology affecting services where we're creating jobs that now are going to lead to major disruption, even in employment in services, leaving aside offshoring of jobs to emerging markets. So there are these major long-term trends, and the nature of automation and robotics is very different than the past, and therefore I think it's going to be a big issue in advanced economies.
I'm going to ask you
something that we don't have a clear solution. Yes, education, training, but can we all become trained and educated?
We are almost out of time. I'm going to ask each of you one very quick question. I started out noting that the recovery, the expansion is going to be 5 years old at the end of the second quarter. As I say, sort of historically, that puts it, you know, on the longer end of expansions over the post-war period. I'll ask each of you how much longer is it going to go on? John, do you have a sense? Are we getting mature now, or is it going to be?
I think it'll go on. Unfortunately, I don't see it ever getting a real recovery right now. We never, you know, remember the 4%, 5% we could have had coming out of this? I think we could have had. We could debate that, but it looks like we're giving up on that, and I think that's the big.
But another 2 or 3 years, you think we can go like this? Yeah. Nouriel, quickly, how long?
Oh, I think there's still ongoing deleveraging. There are these financial imbalances that we're building up because of easy monetary policy. I worry actually that we're going to create a huge bubble in the next 2 years in real estate, in credit, in the equity markets, and like the last time around, that boom in a bubble is going to end up into a bust and a crash.
Glad to see that Dr. Doom is back. Ken, quickly, how much longer?
Yeah, but I mean, probably not for a couple of years at least. I mean, I think that the recovery has been very slow, but there's still a lot of the forces that allow you to have a continuing recovery. We do have a lot of unemployed who still want to work. We're not at a situation on the other side of it just before where unemployment had gone almost to 4%, which was clearly overheated. We're not in an overheated economy at the moment.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've discovered, thanks to Nouriel, that robots are going to replace everybody, even eminent economists, but I think you can all agree with me and say that I don't think they could possibly replace these three, so please join me in thanking them very much.